Alright, hello and welcome back to Evidences for Evolution Part 2. I'm Mr. Sparts and welcome to my TED Talk. Okay, so today we want you guys to be able to demonstrate how organisms have evolved from a common ancestor using multiple forms of evidence. Okay, today we're going to talk about the other two forms of evidence, so these notes should be a heck of a lot shorter than the notes for Evidences for Evolution Part 1. Okay, so learning objectives still haven't changed, so we want you guys to be able to define evolutionary theory and then identify and explain the 6 evidences of evolution, and today we will go over the final 2. Okay, so the first evidence that we're going to talk about today is embryology. Embryology is going to be the study of how organisms develop into viable offspring. So viable offspring is just going to mean living offspring. Okay, so studying animals before they are born sheds light on their evolutionary history, or in other words, their common ancestry. So organisms with similar embryonic development may suggest an evolutionary relationship. So over here in the image, we see a human embryo, a monkey embryo, a pig embryo, a chicken embryo, and a salamander embryo. And then, as we move to the right, down the line, we are going to see how how the progression of these animals, or organisms rather, how they progress through embryonic development. Okay, so in each of these stages, you will see, for example, that these 3 look very similar, while these 2 are going to look more similar. And that's a common theme, where these 3 are going to look very similar all the way up until they are born, while these 2 down at the bottom are going to look more similar until they are born, and actually pretty much right up until the larva of fetus stage. Okay, so embryology as evidence is just going to show that organisms with similar embryonic development may suggest an evolutionary relationship. Okay, just a quick explanation on embryology. You guys, with very little research, will probably come across this this evidence that people use to try and disprove embryology as evidence, because in the 19th century, a embryologist named Haeckel drew these pictures of organisms at their different stages of development. So as you can see here, 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 and here, these would be images that Haeckel drew. These images were purposefully manipulated to look more similar than they may actually be. So this image looks a lot like these images here. This was done on purpose. Haeckel purposefully changed and modified them to look a lot more similar than they may actually look when comparing them side by side. If you were to, for example, just pull this out of an egg or pull it out of a human that is pregnant or anything like that. So these images were manipulated or distorted in that way. Okay, why was this done? So he did this to illustrate the similarities between the organisms more clearly. The reason that I still show that these images is a pretty simple explanation, actually. The principles of this idea still hold 100% true, whether Haeckel did actually manipulate them or not. So, for example, humans and, well, in this case, chickens are probably the closest common ancestor. but what it does is it shows you how closely related these organisms are without actually going through all of the embryonic science that goes into this. We can talk about the very complex areas of embryology where we go in and we talk about all the different proteins that code for this and that we can see in across all of these different types of organisms and these different types of organisms. Or we can show these pictures which provide the exact same principles without going through all of this extra work on your guys' end and on my end. So I wanted to just really show you guys that this is an area of evolution that people will try to attack and try to say that it is fake because of these images. These images are not fake. They were just purposefully manipulated by a scientist in the 19th century to try and illustrate the similarities between the organisms much more clearly than just by looking at them with the naked eye. So yeah, I just wanted you guys to know that, being truthful with you and showing you this. But again, the reason that I put like this image up here in the notes at all is just because it shows this evolutionary relationship without actually having to go in and make you guys learn all of these proteins, the way that they work together to form these different structures and all of that, those sorts of things. Okay? Alright, so DNA as evidence. So this is going to be the sixth and final piece of evidence that we are going to look at, and it covers a lot of genetics and DNA, as you might have imagined by the name. So hopefully you guys still remember some of what you learned from Miss Baltazar when you guys studied the DNA structure and all those things. So remember that thymine and adenine are always paired together. Guanine and cytosine are always paired together. Alright, so genetics is one of the largest Genetics is one of the largest contributors to evidence for evolution. So just a couple of things that really illustrate this point. All living organisms use the same 4 nucleic acids to make their DNA. So again, that would be thymine, adenine, guanine, and cytosine, or AGCT. And then all living organisms use the same 20 amino acids to build proteins. Okay, so these are 2 great pieces of evidence that comes from DNA as evidence to support that we all came from a very, 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 very ancient organism, that all life stemmed from this and is continuing to grow and stem off of this very ancient, and by very ancient I mean like 3.4 billion year old organism. Okay, so these 2 pieces of evidence are shown because how else would we have only 4 nucleic acids that we see in every single living organism? How would we only have 20 amino acids that we see in every single living organism if we did not all come from this one ancient species way back when? And that is all that this slide is really trying to illustrate. So, a little bit more into DNA as evidence. So DNA sequence analysis is also a great indicator of the relatedness of 2 organisms. So the more related 2 organisms are, the more similar their DNA. So humans and chimp DNA is roughly 98% similar. And this, if you just put this in a side-by-side comparison where we look at these 2, you'll notice the banding patterns on these 2 chromosomes are extremely similar. Notice the differences here and here. And then there's also some differences down at the bottom here in the banding patterns, just in some of the widths of the different bands. And all this is trying to show you is that humans and chimps have very similar DNA. The way that DNA sequence analysis is done is that they take a chromosome, they read every single one of the base pairs on that chromosome. So for example, they go through like this structure right here. Let's remember what DNA looks like. So every single A and T, every single C and G gets counted, and we get to, and at the end of it, you might have, so say on a chromosome we have 98 million base pairs. So that would be the adenine paired with thymine, the cytosine paired with guanine. We might have 98 million of those pairs. Out of those 98 million, so let's say like 90 million of them are the same. So 90 million of those same base pattern or the same pairings happen at the same positions. Okay? And we will actually be taking a closer look at what that looks like in the review. Okay, so we are already almost done with these slides. So the review, compare the images. So we have a lizard, a tortoise, a pig, and a human. Okay, now, does the human look more similar to the pig or to the lizard embryo? So again, this would be the pig, and this would be the lizard. Whoops, this would be the lizard. Okay, so I want you to pay close attention to the human right now, and we're going to compare these spots right here. So which ones look more alike? Alright, so hopefully you guys were able to come up with the pig. That would be correct. That is the correct response, and we can see that. So we both kind of have this big lump on our stomachs. In humans, it is much more of a like bump. In the pig, it is more of a kind of gradual like hill. We also see this spot right here on both. We also see the eye developing, and we also have this kind of lump here in both of the species. Okay, and the lizard species, it is a little bit different. This eye is looking very large compared to the pig and the human, and this ear hole, I believe is what that is, or the gill slits are much more pronounced. Okay, now, does the lizard embryo look more like the tortoise or the pig embryo? So here we are going to be looking at the lizard and how it compares to the pig and this time the tortoise. Alright, so hopefully you guys came up with the tortoise. Again, we were looking at the middle, or even if you wanted to look at the first embryonic stage. You can see how the eyes look much more similar in these two versus in the pig. The eye hole, or the developing eye, is much smaller. We also see these more pronounced cuts or slits here, and those were the old gill slits, actually. Again, we also see this bump and this bump down here by the tail. Both of these organisms looks much closer in resemblance to each other than it does on the pig. Okay. Now, why might the human, and we said that the pig, put pig back there, look more similar than the human and the tortoise? Okay, so why might the human and the pig look more similar than the human and the tortoise? Okay, so that is actually a quite simple answer. Common ancestry. Okay, so the pig and the human share a closer common ancestor than the human and the tortoise. Okay, and that's all that we are taking away from the graph or from the image, is that when two embryonic stages look more like one another, we are going to be able to say that those two organisms have a closer or a much closer common ancestor than any of the other organisms that we are looking at. So in this case, the pig and the human would have the closest common ancestor when comparing it to the tortoise. Okay? Alright, so here's where we're going to look at DNA evidence. So, which pair of species appears to be the most closely related to species number 2, and what evidence do you have to support this? Okay, so we're going to be taking a look at species 2, so why don't we just highlight that real quick. Alright, now when we go down the line, we're going to see all A's, all T's, and then all of a sudden we see a T here, but we see C here, C here, C here, and C here in species 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we know right away that species 1 is not going to be as closely related as species 2 is to 3, 4, and 5, because this base pair is different than this. So this base is different than this base. Okay? We're going to keep going. So all T's, all C's, all T's, all A's, and then all of a sudden we get 2 C's in species 4 and 5. So here, but 2 T's in species 2 and 3. Okay, so species 2 and species 3 are going to be more closely related to each other than species 2 would be to species 1, species 4, or species 5. Okay. The next question asks us which pair of species appears to be the least closely related to species 2. That would be species 1, based off of the same evidence that we had for why species 3 is the most closely related. Okay, and all this evidence is just going to be right here. So this one has the base pairs that are different, the most base pairs that are different out of all of the others. Okay, so species 1 is going to be the most different. Okay, now and you guys can't discuss with your shoulder partner to come up with the answers. You can't discuss with the class because you guys are listening to this by yourselves, more than likely. So, with that, that's going to cover the notes for DNA evidence and embryonic evidence. So, hope you guys have a great rest of your day, whatever time you may be listening to this, and just enjoy.